Hey everyone, and welcome to this explainer. I am absolutely thrilled you're here today because we're going to dive into a profoundly simple yet totally game-changing concept about how groups actually function, adapt, and survive. So let's just jump right in. I want you to immediately drop yourself into a scene. Picture yourself on a boat, out on the open water. The boat's already in motion, the water is rushing past the hull, everything feels incredibly smooth, and you're making fantastic time. Hold on to that image for me as we get started.
Okay, so now imagine the wind shifts, and I want you to notice what doesn't happen here. It's not some crazy gale-force storm that suddenly hits out of nowhere. It's not this violent event that forces everyone into an immediate, panic-inducing reaction. It's just a slight shift. It's just enough that the sail doesn't sit the exact same way it did a minute ago. And honestly, at first, nothing really happens. The boat keeps moving along. If you were just casually watching, the course would look completely unchanged. The difference is so small, it's incredibly easy to ignore. But the reality is, the wind has changed.
Let's break down how a really effective crew handles this. It's basically 4 micro-events. Step 1, the wind shifts. Step 2, someone on board notices a slight tension in the line, or just a really subtle change in pressure against the sail. It's kind of just this feeling that something is a little off. Step 3, they speak up. And step 4, the course corrects. What I love about this loop is how beautifully it illustrates that a small noticed detail leads to a totally seamless course correction. It's literally just a tiny ripple in the workflow that stops a massive disaster down the line.
And listen to the exact phrase used to trigger that correction. Winds shifted. That's it. It's such a small thing to say. But what's truly interesting here is what that phrase doesn't do. It doesn't stop the boat dead in the water. It doesn't demand some major top-down executive decision. It simply brings the change into view for everyone. It introduces reality right into the environment so that a small, easy adjustment can be made right then and there.
Which brings us to a fundamental rule, the law of the wind. You either adjust or you drift. Because that slight change was noticed early on the boat, nothing dramatic actually has to happen. The sail is tweaked, the course corrects, and the journey continues. Look, you don't argue with the wind, right? You can't debate reality. You simply adapt to it, or you inevitably drift completely off your intended path. So we know exactly how this works out on the water, but let's bring it into our world. Let's pivot from the physical boat directly into the boardroom, the team meeting, or just your modern group dynamics.
Section 1. When groups start drifting.
Now, genuinely think about your own work environment for a second. What actually happens when the wind shifts in your group? Because the exact same pattern we just saw on that boat, it happens in our teams every single day. A problem appears, and it's not a glaring 5-alarm fire that everyone in the company can clearly see. It's a slight delay, or maybe a weird piece of data, or, that incredibly awkward collective silence on a Zoom call where everyone suddenly finds their keyboard fascinating because they know a deadline is slipping. How does your team react to that quiet little whisper?
Here's the tricky part. Early problems are incredibly easy to ignore. The work just continues, the meetings still happen, the project plan still holds, at least, on the surface. And because it's not a fully formed, undeniable crisis yet, your brain, and your group's collective brain, wants to just push past it. It desperately wants to believe the original plan is still perfectly intact.
But to prevent drifting, someone in that meeting has to act like the sailor. They have to voice the workplace equivalent of noticing the wind. They have to say, this isn't lining up, or this might be off, or hey, we should probably take another look at this. It doesn't need to be a complete, perfect analysis. It doesn't need to be absolutely certain. It only needs to be early. This is that incomplete, uncertain, but absolutely critical early signal that reality is starting to pull away from your plan. Now, you might be sitting there thinking, well, obviously people should just speak up. But it's rarely that simple, is it? There's a lot of hidden friction.
Section 2. Forces against speaking up. We have to acknowledge there are massive structural forces at play here. Let's be real, speaking up can carry really heavy social costs. Nobody wants to be the complainer or the roadblock slowing everything down. Plus, layers of management naturally filter out or delay information, which completely strips away the urgency of a quiet concern. And let's face it, good news travels way faster and easier than bad news ever does. Finally, over time, people just learn what is safe to say. Groups naturally, and sometimes totally unconsciously, filter out bad news just to protect themselves and keep the mood positive. All of these forces are constantly working against those early signals.
And so the absolute crucial point is this. When those suppressive forces win, and the early signals get silenced, the boat is still moving. The team keeps working. The budget is still getting spent, but you are not going where you think you are going. Without that early descent, your group slowly but surely disconnects from reality. Timely course correction completely depends on bad news actually reaching the people who make the decisions. So how do we fix this?
How do we break through those forces? Well, we have to actively invite the bad news in.
Section 3. Welcoming early dissent.
Consider this brilliant directive from a leader. If you see a problem, say it now. Dissent is welcomed here. We can't fix what we don't raise while it's still small. Think about that. This isn't just some motivational poster on a break room wall, it's a strategic system. Leaders have to intentionally and loudly create an environment where reality actually reaches the table. They have to make it explicitly safe, and honestly even rewarded, to be the person brave enough to say, hey, the wind's shifted.
When leaders actually do that, they establish a really tight feedback loop. Signal, adjustment, result. The signal reaches the point of attention before decisions are permanently locked in cement. It arrives while a pivot is still very much possible. This tight loop of feedback is what keeps decisions tied to reality, and furthermore, it ensures that leaders feel the consequences of their choices quickly, so they can tweak their strategy based on actual results rather than just blind assumptions.
This leads to a massive fundamental cultural shift for a team. Suddenly, the group doesn't feel the need to defend what was already decided. When dissent is welcomed early on, you stop wasting all your energy stubbornly protecting an outdated plan just because you spent 3 weeks making it. If something no longer fits, the feedback drives the change. You actually get to respond to what is happening in reality rather than fighting tooth and nail to preserve a fantasy. So we've seen the mechanics of this, but let's talk about the ultimate payoff. Why is this so incredibly vital for the success of any project?
Section 4. The cost of signals. I want you to think about the stark contrast in costs here. If you welcome early signals, you catch the problem when it is just a whisper. It requires a really small adjustment, it's incredibly cheap to fix, and your team's credibility remains completely intact. But what about late signals? If you wait until the problem is a full-blown, unavoidable crisis, decisions are already locked in, the correction is incredibly expensive in time, in money, and in team morale, and honestly, your team looks completely disconnected from reality.
And that right there brings us to the core takeaway of this entire explainer. Early signals stay cheap, late signals stay expensive. It is a stark, absolute, undeniable reality. The earlier the signal, the smaller the adjustment. A tiny shift right now prevents a massive, painful correction down the road. Just think back to that tension on the boat's sail. Fixing it when you first feel it? Effortless. Ignoring it until the mast literally snaps in half? That is a catastrophe.
So I want to leave you with a provocative question today. Really take a moment to evaluate your own leadership and your own teams. Is your group adjusting to the wind, or are you just drifting? Are you actively welcoming the early dissent that keeps you tied to reality, or are the quiet forces of silence pushing you way off course? Remember, you can't argue with the wind. Thank you so much for hanging out with me for this explainer. Keep your eyes on the sail, keep welcoming that dissent, and I'll see you all next time.